So when it comes to grant writing, in the universe, because it's not just about the world, there are problems. You as a researcher, you have an idea that could solve these problems. And then there's a donor or funding partner who has the money, but the two of you need to come to a compromise. Whichever way you look at it, it has to be value for money. It's all about cost effectiveness. You have a solution, they have the money, but you have to meet halfway. And how you meet halfway could be one of two events, where the donor seeks you after you pitch, just like the way Neema and Mabel, after the pitching session here, they more or less have $10,000. No, 10, is it 10? Only 10. Either way, they already have money from a pitch to get going with whatever they have. So that the donor listened to them and gave them the money to get them started. Or it's you seeking money from a funder, which is more or less what majority of my presentation will be about. But at the end of the day, the key thing to note is it has to be value for money. You're pitching an idea to someone. The science, the details, that's really exciting for you. But for the donor, it's all about value for whatever money they're putting in, they're investing in your idea. So the best time to get started working on your budget is as soon as you identify the call. Because with each funder, they have allowable and disallowable costs. So you have to know, does your idea fit into their requirements? Because you could have the best idea ever known, but as long as it doesn't fit to their funding scheme, you will not get funding. So it's not about your idea not being the best, but it's just not fitting their requirements and what they're interested in. And your budget must align with your proposed objectives. It must be feasible in the timeline that you're proposing, and it also absolutely has to be consistent with your institutional rules and regulations. So as researchers, there's a tendency you write a proposal and you think about yourself as an individual, but none of us are ever doing anything as an individual. You're being hosted in an institution which has rules and regulations. So while it may feel good to say you earn $10,000 a month, for as long as your institution's HR policies do not calculate you at $10,000 a month, that will not get funded. And also remember, you're not the only person from that institution asking for money from this specific donor. So many other people, many years before you and many years after you, have got funding from this person. So more or less, they know what the budget lines should be as far as personnel costs, as far as overhead costs. So it's never really anything new. It's more so a revision to keep up with the times of how the institution is growing as well in its management, but also how you're proposing to do the work given your proposed objectives. So it's never really anything new. So you have to be absolutely consistent. Otherwise, it looks bad on the institution where you have Samson and Fredros submitting with two different budgets, yet say they're of the same institution. It doesn't work like that. It's either one of you will get dropped or all of you will get dropped. That's an example. Which you have to be careful because they will ask for budget justifications, and if the two of you do not align, the likelihood of both of you getting dropped is higher than one of you getting picked up. For common items, yes. So not about your idea and the nitty-gritties. They're basics in every institution. Their overhead costs, their personnel costs, their direct costs. These, more or less, tend to be the same. So for example, I'll use the grand challenges exploration. There's some specific things when it comes to such callings or funding schemes. The project has to be 18 months. You're not asking for money for 24 months. It's 18 months from the day it's signed. So whatever you budget for cannot exceed $100,000. It cannot be 101. 100. And you know this from the moment you see the call. You know that you cannot be reimbursed expenses incurred prior to the start date. And this is clear. So you cannot start buying a laptop hoping to have it reimbursed at the point where you've started work. That's a disallowable cost. No Zawadi is permitted to make sub-payments to all, but I highlight particularly payments to co-PIs working at other organizations. And this is why I said the best time to engage with the budget is as soon as you know the call, because these are always part of that call. You know, many people run to the deadline and what the various categories for the call is and miss out a lot of these details, because this more or less tells you who you can engage with and to what capacity you can engage with that person. Because your co-PI has to know that their payments may or may not be part of that process, part of that project, and they have to be okay with that so that you know how else you're going to compensate for their time, because this is time invested, and it's only appropriate that they get compensation for their time. So the phase 1 projects, because with every donor more or less, there's a phase 1 and phase 2. At first, they're taking a risk with you, so that's the phase 1. They will cover the full direct costs. So these are the actual costs to work on your idea. No Zawadi will be entitled to use funds to cover indirect costs, and that's where it's quite ambiguous for every donor. So these are the overhead expenses. You know, it's with your institution, they always say we want overhead costs because that's how we run. But depending on the call you're attending to, this could be disallowed, and you have to engage with your grants office so that it is well known that they will not be able to get overhead costs, and as an institution, whether that's okay for them and how that will be hosted. Because again, the contract is not with you. The contract is with the institution that you work with. Their reputation is the reason, more or less, why you will be funded that grant. So all of these things, you have to engage with everyone at every step of your grant application process. It's not just about my great idea. When you're talking about funding, it's you and the institution and how the grant will actually be able to be financed and managed throughout. Administrative expenses. Again, you're the scientist, the researcher here. Someone has to do your administration, someone has to do your accounting, finances. But again, you have to know that some donors will allow for the payments of that accountant to be a part of that budget or not, and how your institution is willing to support you in the case where, as Grant Challenge Exploration Phase 1, where that's a disallowable cost, and as well as the executive oversight and whatnot. Also, another key thing is all awardees are entitled to purchase equipment provided, and the cost of each item is less than $5,000. So some people, you know, you get excited, this is where I want to own a project car. Your project car does not cost $5,000. And if it's above that, you have a problem. So these are the details that you have to know even before you get started, because then you know if this is the call for your idea or not. You don't want to spend so much time getting into the details of pursuing a specific call only to get to the end and find that you were disqualified solely because of your budget. It just did not fit what the donor required from you. And again, the income has to be used for or committed to the project. Again, as scientists, most of us work in institutions where we get paid off of projects. So it's easy to want to move funds from one budget line to the other, from one project to the other. Again, this is not your money. Someone else is investing in you, and they want accountability of that penny. Again, value for money. So whatever you do not use to do their idea, they want it back, because that's more or less, if not your next project money, it's your neighbor's next funding scheme. So again, here, we're investing in each other. You have the idea, they have the money. It's a collaboration. Payment and reporting. So again, for the Grand Challenge Exploration, it's a one-time fee. They give you the money, you go off-run, you have 18 months to do whatever you want to do. And a lot of scientists forget there's the reporting, there's the scientific part where for researchers it's easy. You know, you have your scientific report, you have your publications, that's amazing. But that has to align with your finances. If you said you're going to work in a lab, but your budget somewhere, you're reporting you bought a car, you know, the donor will quickly ask, how did your lab work need a car? You know, what were you using the car for? From your house to the lab? I mean, how is that related? So you have to be careful. And I know eventually as you work in institutions, there are ways around how you work that, but you have to be extremely careful about it because that quickly becomes a disallowable cost after 18 months where you cannot return this car where you bought it, and neither can the institution absorb the cost of that car because then the donor wants all of the money that was spent on that car back because then they don't acknowledge it as something that was used for their specific idea. So this is just an example of how the Grand Challenges Exploration expect your budget to be. As you can see, they've kept it as simple as possible, and that's to give you more or less as much flexibility, but also to constrain you in well within the requirements and what's allowable and disallowable. So there's personnel costs, and this is including salary, fringe benefits, tuition, or other direct compensation. Something that's important to note is that quickly they can tell from here whether you're working to pay yourselves as opposed to doing the work, or the other way around. Because if your salary, your personnel costs are much higher than doing anything, you know, they might as well just have given you a paycheck directly. You know, they're not employing you. You've asked for money to do specific work. So this is always a very neat way to know whether this money is going to be used to pay people or to actually get the work done. So whenever you write a proposal, yes, your time has to be compensated for it, but you have to be keen and careful that it's not 60% of the budget paying yourself and about only 20,000 to do the work. Because then they might as well just say, we'll give you 20,000 to do the work because you're already an employee of someone, and then we'll keep the rest. So again, this is value for money, so be careful about it. And then there's the subcontracts. Who are you collaborating with, to what capacity, and can you give them a legal agreement to work together, and what's the maximum amount allowable to share with them? Because then that also means you cannot do the work. They might as well give that other person that money and get the work done at a much cheaper cost. Because again, as it has been mentioned before, it's competition. Your collaborator today is your competitor tomorrow. Because they're also writing grants about the same thing. You have the expertise. So who you're collaborating with, it's a competition of who can do it for the cheapest price. It's cost effectiveness. The donors have the money, and they want value for money and scalability, because the person who can do it for the cheapest quickly becomes the person who can scale it up into the rest of the country, depending on how the results work. So you have to be careful about all those details. Your capital and assets, your travels. Sometimes the easiest way to wiggle around the budget lines, the personnel costs, especially with research, there's a lot of travel included. So you can play around between these two lines, but you have to be sure it doesn't look like, again, you're paying yourselves more than you are actually doing the actual work or testing your idea, because again, this is money to test that idea that you have, not to pay you to travel around the country and the world, you know, seeing places. That's not the point. And as you can see, other expenses always have to be justified. Accountability. So in my experience in the past 12 months now in the grants office, personnel time is the biggest thing that every donor wants to dig into, pull apart, and understand why. Because again, this is value for money. Is it value for money for me to pay you to do this work? If that's the case, should I just poach you from your institution and bring you to my institution and then get the work done at a cheaper cost? Or are you actually doing the work and paying yourselves for the sake of it? So as a result, with your application, all personnel listed, your qualifications have to match the work that you're proposing to do. In our institutions, I guess here, we're all paid from project to project. And there comes a time my project has ended, I don't have salary, but Sam has a project. I'm not really working in Sam's project, but he's, you know, the added means to the project to get paid. You have to be careful about that because when Sam is submitting his reports, I have to be justified what I did for that specific project. So if my qualifications, like now I'm in the grants office, and Sam is a mathematics modeler, so there's no way I contributed anything in the mathematical modeling study. So that is something they will question. Because then, as you have seen, grant management expenses are not allowed. So from the beginning, I'm already listed as a disallowable cost because I work in the grant management office. So I cannot appear as personnel who worked in a mathematical modeling study because what was my contribution there? You will have to track the time that's spent by every staff that's employed in the project. And this can be in the level of effort put within the office, in the project, whether it's in percent of time or a couple of days or whatever the case is, you have to be able to justify what Zawadi did for that 30% of her time within that month. Is there any report written by Zawadi to show what she did for that 30% of time? So your timesheets are really important. And it's easy to say you can copy what I did last month into the next month, but increasingly donors are becoming very keen about it because everybody wants cheap labor, so to speak. So it's value for money. How can I get this done at the cheapest cost possible? This job did not need someone with a PhD. So why am I paying 30% for someone with a PhD, which is more expensive, when whatever you say they're doing could have been done by someone with a BSc? So these are the key things that you really need to be keen about when it comes to personnel costs on your budget. And more or less, there's always a fine line somewhere in very small print that they expect you to submit copies of records upon request. And this is why I'm saying, while it may not seem obvious that they want copies of what Zawadi did, but if they think there's a discrepancy, it's always there. A lot of people do not pay attention to it, but there's always a line where I want to see the copies of who got paid and what they did and why. So you have to be careful when you're putting who's on your personnel, what they're doing, and what their contribution to the project is. Most importantly, donors are human beings and they're not constipated, which means everything is negotiable. Yes, the rules and regulations will say this is not allowed, this is allowed, this is that. But they do understand that different countries, different institutions are at different places, and there's no one cookie, there's no one solution for everybody. So as a result, if you have the great idea, you're 75% of the way there, there's always a contact person that you can send an email to and state your case as an institution. Worst case scenario, they'll say no. Best case scenario, they'll alter that specific clause to fit you. So I know like the Grant Challenges Canada, a lot of the time the grants, they say you have to create a separate bank account for their money. But as an institution, you've been around, you've worked with so many donors, you can also state your case that you're not the only donor that we work with. We've worked with several donors, we have our own financing system, this is how it works. And once you justify that, they will work with you with whatever system you have. So as a researcher, while this may not seem as something that will affect you, you have to understand that your idea is hosted by an institution, and how the institution works will affect whether you can or cannot get that specific grant. And another thing is researchers, again, you like flexibility. You know, you want to go out in the field, you know, I've noticed a new thing, so I'm just gonna, you know, go off on my own and try this idea. Again, whatever budget that was approved, that's what the donor is expecting you to do. They didn't pay you to go out and try many other tangent things. So there's always a clear line that says, transfer of costing, if they're small-scale transfers, it's okay. Because for them, that's also building you to have the next great idea. So sometimes they allow you to, maybe $3,000, it's okay. But if whatever you're trying out is costs more than that, then you have to contact them and ask. So I know a lot of researchers struggle with the finance team because the finance will always not approve the payment for you to do that. But that's because the donor expects you to do only that which you wrote you would do. So the flexibility is more or less there, but you have to be keen on how you present it to the funders as well, so that they can accommodate you with whatever ideas that are coming up as you continue with your research. So some examples of significant fund transfers. Students being employed for less than amount of the time. Again, personnel is usually more or less one of the bigger costs in any project. Staff spending less time working overseas, funding for research management costs being spent for other activities, major changes to the research staffing, major changes into the animal usage, depending on whether you get ethics approval or not to do that which you wanted, and the equipment purchases. Again, donors are always, their doors are always open. There's always someone's name who's listed as a point of contact. You do not lose anything sending them an email and asking, rather than you spending the money to do that and them discrediting that as a disallowable cost much later, because then they just do not negotiate at that point. It's not allowed, it's done. So you're better off always asking before you spend any money other than spending and then asking thereafter. So how to budget for, so I have a few diagrams to more or less show the whole budgeting process. When it comes to personnel costs, it's important to know that it goes beyond the study investigators that more or less always end up on the application. As Silas was saying this morning, there are technicians, the lab people, there's the driver you have if your project needs a car. So when you think about your proposal and what you're doing, once you have your methods and objectives nailed down, that's the time to start engaging with your budget. Because for objective 1, I need to establish a colony. Who do you need to help you establish a colony? So you need to start having an Excel sheet where you start writing who is associated with each objective that you have. Because then that way you do not miss anyone when you're done writing your proposal. So once you have your objectives written down, your methods for each section, then you know exactly who you need when it comes to personnel. And that helps you a lot more because at the end of the day, most of the times, not all the study investigators end up on your budget. It's usually the junior staff and the supporting staff because they are the ones who end up doing a lot of the actual physical hard work while you're off running and writing your next big idea. So it's important not to just think of yourself as a PI, budget your salary, and forget all of the other technical and supporting staff who are really the most important people when it comes to executing your idea. And again, depending on who your funder is, you work in an institution and there's project supporting staff that help you. Your project needs an administrator who will run around with your ethic approvals, who will run around with your meetings if the donor is coming around. And you also need an accountant. There's no project in an institution that does not have an accountant. So you have to budget for their time as well. Because again, it's not just about your science, it's also about the management of your grant. And the supporting staff, sometimes, especially given that this is about money when it comes to the donor, they're equally as important than your output. Because your findings could be, it doesn't work. But the donor's money was spent. And they need to justify value for money. At what point did it not work? When you're budgeting for travel, so there's two, traveling is international and there's local traveling. Because a lot of travel surrounds your dissemination, whether you're introducing your project to the village or your study site, or you're disseminating your results after you study. So it's important, a lot of people will budget for conference and meetings and a lot of the various stakeholders, and you forget your study site. I want to say, I believe every ethical approval always has a line. You have to sensitize the community you work in, and you have to disseminate results to the community you've worked in. Disseminating results is a cost, because you have to have a meeting with them before, and you have to have a meeting with them after. And a meeting is not, you don't sit under a tree. You have a meeting, you're in a hotel room, that's a cost. You have to feed them, that's a cost. So this is where you more or less, as you work through your objectives, you work on your budget. What do I need for a meeting? I need a room, I need some food or some refreshments, I need the people in it. And how those people are compensated is different depending on your country and the ethics surrounding that. When you're going international, it's not just about your per diem. There's your flight there, there's your subsistence while you're there, there's your visa. There's so many costs that you need to be keen on as you budget for all of this. Again, the dissemination of results. I'm also running out of time, so I'll be quick. And then there's your collaborations. Who are you collaborating with? What are their expenses? How can you accommodate all of that? And will that fit your budget? Because at the end of the day, this determines how much, whether your proposal fits that specific call or not. Because again, the Grand Challenges Exploration is only $100,000. So if you have a collaborator whose cost is about 50, that already more or less disqualifies you for that specific cost. But your idea always comes first, because based on that, you know how to scale it. Can you do that same work within 18 months? And how much will you reduce the cost if you do it within 18 months? And then that way, you'll be able to fit your proposal into the Grand Challenge Explorations, for example. So to sum up, one last thing. There's the direct costs and indirect costs. So with every institution, again, indirect costs are the overheads where you don't work under a tree. You work under an institution. It has its rules and regulation. It has things that keep it running. So those are the indirect costs. It has a director and all of that. So you have to support the institution that you work with in one way or another, because they're also supporting you by hosting you with the project. You got the funding because they have built a reputation that's worth funding as well. But you have to be keen about your direct costs, because those are the ones that are directly involved with your project, and you cannot compromise on them. So you have to be careful about all these different things. Your staff, the equipment that you need. When you're working on your database and data management, then you know, do I need a shelf cabinet for my informed consent form? Or is everything collected online, therefore I need tablets? So again, as you engage with your methods and objectives section, that is when you start more or less an Excel sheet, where with each objective you identify who you need and what equipment you need, and then you start working, because at the end of the day, these things have to align with each other. So that is the end of my presentation.